Year 10, Mr. Tapley here for your next lesson of Year 10 History. At this lesson, we are looking at developing our understanding of this term assimilation. So what does it mean? And what were the assimilation practices embedded in Australian post-World War II migration policies? So we started off with the White Australia policy in the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901. That occurred for another 40-50 years. After World War II, we've had to change it. What's happening with assimilation? So outlining changes to the World War II migration policies and defining this term, cultural assimilation. So, a bit of a recap from the last lesson we looked at. The Australian government post-World War II introduced a changed approach to immigration aimed at increasing the population because of our national security and economic concerns. So they changed the approach. Before it was only English-speaking white people, so British, Irish, Scottish. Now we're letting in other white people. So although we've made it more inclusive, it's still very much a white Australia policy. So you're still bringing in white people from Poland, Ukraine, Czechoslovakia. The new Prime Minister, so Ben Chifley was the first person to introduce immigration, I guess, on a wide scale in 1945. The new Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, came in 1949, and he expanded the immigration scheme even further. So for the first time in Australian history, hundreds of non-European war refugees were allowed to remain in Australia. So when Japan was marching through the Pacific, just gaining victories and taking down the Philippines, Singapore, etc., a lot of war refugees from Indonesia and the Philippines fled to Australia, and they stayed in Australia until the war was over. But Robert Menzies, the Prime Minister, allowed hundreds of war refugees to stay there. So that was the first time any non-whites were allowed to stay in Australia, any non-white immigrants. This decision was shortly followed by the 1950 Colombo Plan, which allowed a small number of students, from Asian countries to study at Australian universities. So for the first time, many Australians met an Asian person, which might sound weird to you guys today, but that was a big deal in 1950 Colombo Plan, because for the first time they got to meet these people that they'd heard so many negative things about from wartime propaganda and from the government, and they actually met these people and they said, oh, these are decent, good people, which put a bit of pressure on the government to then change stuff in the future, because once the people got to meet non-Europeans, they told the government, no, they're cool, you can let them stay. These changes were significant. However, the majority of Australians continued to support a white Australia policy. So although those people who met those students from the Colombo Plan were like, yeah, keep them around, the majority of Australians were still Team White Australia. And the people who had come here, so migrants from Italy, Greece, Spain, Poland, whatever, the migrants who did come here were experiencing discrimination and challenges in their new home. By the 1950s, further migrants from Europe far outnumbered British arrivals. These migrants arrived from dozens of different national, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds. However, while immigration restrictions were somewhat relaxed, these new arrivals were still expected to act Australian. I quite like that little political cartoon there. That's actually from modern times. That was after the Afghanistan-Iraq war, when we had refugees coming in from that region. We're a very tolerant society in Australia, but if you don't behave like us, you can go back to where you bloody came from. Sigh. We still had people coming in from different countries, but we expected them to be Australian, so they had to give up their past. The key element of national immigration policy was this term assimilation. So immigrants were expected to assimilate, to come into Australia and be Australian. They had to give up their previous culture and adopt Australian culture and traditions. Throw away your banh mi, you're having a sausage roll for lunch. You're not allowed to listen to K-pop, you're listening to AC/DC. A refusal to assimilate and forget their heritage could lead to racial discrimination. So that could be, you're not allowed to stay in this house or in this community. You're not allowed to work this job, or I'm going to bully your children at school. Something like that. Watch the following video, please. This video talks about first-generation immigrant Smriti Ram discussing her experiences and challenges of cultural diversity in modern times. In 2016, the National Census, which is a survey, 50% of Australians were either born overseas or had parents born overseas. There are over 300 languages identified in Australia, and 20% spoke a language other than English at home. At Glen Waverley Secondary College, 89% of students have a non-English language background. Our modern nation is diverse and multicultural. Hasn't always been that way, but a key skill we aim to develop in history isn't just source analysis. It's developing empathy. You don't really have this in maths or in science. Having the opportunity to view the stories and view the experiences, the lives of past people, and then develop not just your knowledge, but your emotions. Develop your empathy, your ability to consider the emotions, experience, and suffering of past people. So you're not bloody monsters. So you don't look at the Holocaust and be like, oh, lol. So imagine if you were asked to forget your culture. So your language, your religion, traditions, food, music, sport, literature, your ideals. Imagine facing racial discrimination or persecution if you did not assimilate. That's what this video is about. She talks about her experiences in America and Singapore, coming to school as someone who was not from that country. Cool. So lesson activities for today are kind of connecting this stuff about, I guess, culture and about your personal experiences with culture and the past. So assimilation of culture in the 1950s. Read through chapter 5, pages 240 to 42 to answer the questions below. So we're looking at chapter 5.2. You want pages 240, 241, 242. And I've lost my thing. There it is. Question 1. Why did Arthur Colwell believe it was important that the nation introduced large-scale European migration to Australia? So why did we relax the white Australian policy and let in people from the Baltic regions, from Germany, from Spain, Italy, Greece, etc.? Question 2. What was the assimilation policy in Australian post-World War II immigration practices? So trying to define that term there, assimilation. What does that mean? Question 3. What challenges did immigrants such as Mario Millo encounter when attempting to assimilate in Australia? So in chapter 5.2, specifically source 5.25, Mario tells you about his experiences as a child growing up in primary school, post-World War II immigration, and some of the challenges he experienced. So go read that and answer question 3. And then question 4, I'm bringing it home to, I guess, a personal reflection. Reflect upon your own personal cultural background. How would you feel if you were forced to abandon your culture and assimilate? So no wrong answer here. I just want you guys to think about your own experiences, your own culture. How would you feel if you were forced to give up your religion, your language, your food, music, sport, all those things that make you who you are, your identity, your values? How would you feel if you were forced to give that away, I suppose? Just getting you to think about your thinking. I had someone ask me the other day, what was your first... I was reading Mario's source about how he was in primary school, and that made me think about, well, what did I know that racism existed in primary school? Like, what was your first realization that racism occurred? What was your first experience with racism? And I can't really remember. Anyway, that's a question to consider for another day. So you got 4 questions to smash out in the lesson activities in your digital notebook. Any questions or concerns, please let me know. Otherwise, best of luck with that. Hope you're well, and cheers.